This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 536 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. My bold predictions article, it dropped on Friday last week. A lot of you guys were asking about it, but I won't be doing that episode until next week. I'll take 10 of the 15 bold predictions that I talked about in that article, and I'll add a couple specifically for you podcast listeners. I'll run through all of that next week. But if you want to see the bold predictions article before that, head to my Twitter account or just go to numberfire.com and you should be able to find it. Instead of doing that episode right now, today, I'm doing what I do towards the end of August every single year. I'm talking risers and fallers. I'm talking about players I may have hyped or maybe talked down throughout the offseason, or even players that I didn't. And I'll be explaining why they've moved up or down my rankings over the last month or so. In some cases, they stayed in a similar spot in my rankings, but they rose or they fell in ADP. And that changed the way that I view them. Now, before getting to the risers and fallers, I want to remind you about the MLB Single Entry Series presented by RotoGrinders. Each week, enter a featured Single Entry Series contest to win cash and compete for a seat in the $40,000 online final. Just play daily, and FanDuel will add your 4 highest point totals together to get your combined score and rank for the week. So head over to FanDuel and enter the MLB Single Entry Series today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Najee Harris is my first riser. One of my bold predictions, and this is a spoiler alert, I'm sorry, but one of my bold predictions this year is that Najee Harris will finish as a top 8 running back in fantasy football. Much has been made about the Steelers' offensive line, and look, I agree. It's not good. It's bad on paper. But I feel like when we make that offensive line excuse, we're ignoring the far more important piece to fantasy football. It's volume. And Najee Harris should have that. He's been dominating first-team snaps in the preseason. Everyone's referring to him as a bell cow back, and we know he has the skill set to be that guy. Not only that, even though draft capital isn't everything, the Steelers are in win-now mode with Ben Roethlisberger being 39 years old. His career's coming to an end. And the Steelers went out and spent a first-rounder to get Najee Harris. They didn't draft him to throw him on the bench. I said this in my bold predictions piece, but let's just run through an exercise here. James Conner, when he broke out in Pittsburgh, he played 13 games and he still handled more than 70% of Pittsburgh's running back rushes, and he had better than a 10% target share. Since 2011, we've had 39 running backs hit those marks. Of those 39, all but 2 of them finished in the top 10 at the position. Clearly, a player seeing that type of workload, that means he was probably healthy throughout the year, or most of the year. We see that with running back rankings all the time in the way that they finish. But even on a points per game basis, 33 of the 39 hit 17 PPR points per game. That would have been the RB8 last season. I care about the offensive line in Pittsburgh. I'd love for it to be the best in the league. But Harris is going to be fed, and that seems to get lost sometimes. I was never low on Harris, but I've drafted him a lot over the last month, so I'm giving him a shout today. David Montgomery was someone who I was not into to start the offseason, but I've gradually pushed him up my running back rankings, and the main reason for that is Tariq Cohen. I'm not sure Cohen is actually going to be a thing given his recovery from last year's injury, and that's going to help David Montgomery's target share. Yes, Damian Williams is there now, I know. But Montgomery averaged almost a 13% target share per game last year without Tariq Cohen. It's a small sample size, but in the 3 games with Cohen, that number was 8.6%. And he reached a high of 11% in a single game. Now, I agree with you that the schedule to end last year for Chicago, that was really nice for David Montgomery. It was easy. That played a role in Montgomery going absolutely nuts in fantasy football. And I'll also agree with you that Montgomery probably won't see quite the workload that he saw last year because there is still better competition this season in that backfield. I'm also not aggressively going after David Montgomery in drafts just because of the wide receivers who get drafted around him. But I have to call him out on today's show as a riser because he is a riser. I feel way better about David Montgomery today than I did 3 months ago. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Tariq Cohen is not 100%. The last running back riser for me today is Darrell Henderson. When the Cam Akers injury went down last month, I expected Henderson's ADP to rise significantly. Like significantly more than it actually did. But he's reasonably priced in my opinion. And I've bought into him a little bit more over the last month. My feelings on Henderson are more game theory driven than anything else. It's not super numbers heavy. Because I don't think it needs to be. He's being drafted around RB20 right now. But we obviously know there could be room for growth there. It's not necessarily expected, but Cam Akers was a second-round pick before he got hurt. Henderson's being selected way after that because of the idea that he's not as much of a bell cow workhorse than Akers is. And I would agree with that. I've mentioned that on the podcast. Henderson has a pretty big history of not being a bell cow. With that being said, there's still a chance that he sees a good amount of work in that Rams backfield. And that Rams offense is going to be probably one of the better offenses in the league. And it's one that's been run heavy close to the end zone since Sean McVay took over. So I would argue, and my projections agree with me, I would argue that Henderson is being drafted closer to his floor than his ceiling, as long as he stays healthy. Now, I don't want to say RB20 is his absolute floor. I just mean there's room for growth for that ADP, when it's harder to get that from other running backs going around him. Now, as usual, best ball leagues have been sharper, in my opinion, about Darrell Henderson. And he's priced a lot higher there than other places. But if you're playing on a platform like ESPN or Yahoo, you'll see someone like Josh Jacobs going ahead of Darrell Henderson. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Jacobs outscores Darrell Henderson this year. But that's not the point. Like I talked about in the Players to Avoid episode, Jacobs is probably not going to see an increase in target share with Kenyon Drake in that backfield. He hasn't been utilized as a receiver in the NFL. So you have a cap ceiling for Josh Jacobs. You have a cap ceiling for a guy like J.K. Dobbins to a degree too. And guys, on ESPN right now, Chase Edmonds is going one spot after Darrell Henderson. Like, there are far more concerns about Chase Edmonds than Darrell Henderson. So I'd watch for Henderson in your home leagues. He may end up being a value because I don't think everyone's properly recognizing his upper range of outcomes. I know that was less mathematic than my typical approach, but sometimes you just have to talk it out and try to think a little bit more feel-based about situation and upside. Okay, I'm done with running back risers. Let's move to wide receiver. This is just a general trend that I've found myself doing in drafts this month. I'm buying a lot of rookie wide receivers, especially Devontae Smith. I bought the injury discount on Smith, and I think he's probably going to be reasonably priced throughout draft season. There's a lot to like about him. He was a 98th percentile prospect in my model. He's the top option on the Eagles, so the target share ceiling is there, and he fits some of the criteria that I talked about on the breakout wide receiver episode last month. He's the top pass catcher being drafted from his team by ADP. And in those middle rounds, he doesn't have any wide receiver from the Eagles being drafted with him. That's given us a better hit rate historically than the alternative. Now, of course, there's some worry about Jalen Hurts as a passer, but I'm into Smith. Especially because the front half of that Eagles season, they have a great schedule. But I'm also into throwing darts at players like Terrace Marshall and Rondale Moore. For all of you who listen to my show this offseason, you know that I'm a big Terrace Marshall guy. I was higher on him than the majority of fantasy analysts in the industry. He played that Justin Jefferson role at LSU last year and played 73% of his snaps from the slot. That's where he can fit in right away with Carolina. Curtis Samuel played a lot of slot snaps for the Panthers last year when Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore stayed usually on the perimeter. And for the record, when I reference playing in the slot, I never mean that a player specifically plays in the slot. It's not that binary. A lot of guys move around. I'm just saying that in Marshall's case, he can walk in and play a lot of snaps from that area of the field given his experience there last year. And it'd probably be an easier transition to the NFL. So he can find the field quickly, which means he'll have a shot to showcase his talent. And he already has in the preseason. But regardless, I don't think it's a bad idea to throw a dart at Marshall in your redraft league. And Rondale Moore is likely to be a slot guy too for Arizona. He's played almost exclusively there during the preseason, and he's getting work. I'd expect AJ Green or Christian Kirk to take the perimeter work, probably AJ Green, and then DeAndre Hopkins on the opposite side. And then Rondale Moore could thrive in that inside role. That's where he belongs in the NFL. That's where he's always belonged in the NFL. He can do damage there. Just don't ignore the rookie wide receivers this year. It was a great class, and a lot of the upper end guys, they're already showing that they can have a decent sized workload in year one. Although there is one that I'm going to talk about later who I may ignore. I'm in on Jakobi Meyers. I wrote him up in my bold predictions article, so I may end up talking about him on next week's show, but I am in. What's the one thing statistically that translates year over year most? Volume. Volume is what matters each year in fantasy football, but it's also what's stickiest year over year. Meyers only played 14 games last year, and he still had a 19% target share in New England's offense. On a per game basis, he had almost a 25% target share. From week 7 onward, his target share per game was almost 32%. He's already doing well in the preseason, and he's already getting hype. But let's just ignore that for a second. Who are you afraid of in this offense? Nelson Agholor, Kendrick Bourne, those banged up tight ends, although I do like Jonnu Smith. Jakobi Meyers should be going far earlier in drafts. And the more that he's gotten love and him having this good preseason, he's an obvious riser for me. I got a mailbag question a handful of weeks ago talking about Tua Tagovailoa and how I felt about him as a late round quarterback pick. At the time, I said he was fine, but I preferred either going up and getting Ryan Tannehill or just kind of getting Trey Lance or Justin Fields slightly after Tua. Now things are different. Not just because Tua has looked great in the preseason, but because Lance and Fields have jumped Tua pretty significantly in ADP. So Tua isn't in this no man's land area in the draft. He's got some rushing appeal. And like I mentioned on that show, I love what Miami is putting around him. He did throw into tight windows last year, but he was also working with wide receivers and pass catchers who didn't separate well. Those numbers don't tell the whole story. And he's been open in saying that he's not that kind of quarterback. And we know he's not that kind of quarterback. He's not Ryan Fitzpatrick. Fitzpatrick worked well for a player like Devontae Parker because Parker uses his body to go up and grab passes as opposed to just separating from his defender. We won't get that with Will Fuller and Jalen Waddle. It makes sense to surround Tua with those types of players. But yeah, I'm much more into Tua now because the market is changing. It's changing with the other late round quarterback options. My good friend Rich Rebar, or at Lord Reeves on Twitter, he sent a thought-provoking tweet about Antonio Gibson last week. The tweet said, "Starting to get weird feelings that we are setting up Antonio Gibson the exact same way we did early run Joe Mixon. Jumping all the way from A to Z based on how we'd use the player. Hopefully the outcome is better this trip." I'm starting to get those same feelings. Gibson is being called out here as a faller because of what's going on in the preseason with his pass catching. I've talked about Gibson at length on this show during the offseason. My general stance has been that he's a mega buy. I had him as a buy on my Dynasty Buy Candidate episode back in the early parts of 2021. I loved Antonio Gibson last year. I love his long-term outlook. I love me some Antonio Gibson. But does the football team? Gibson probably is in store for touchdown regression. In order to combat that, he's going to need to be in a better offense, which is likely. But he'll also need to catch a lot more passes. He ended last year with a target share per game rate under 10%. As we know, J.D. McKissic got a lot of work through the air out of that backfield. So far in the preseason, that hasn't really changed. This is courtesy of my friend John Daigle from NBC Sports, but Daigle tweeted that Ryan Fitzpatrick has played 9 third downs this preseason. On those third downs, J.D. McKissic has been on the field for 7 of them. Antonio Gibson has only been on the field for 1 of them, and it was a 3rd and 1. Maybe Ron Rivera and company are just messing with us. I mean, I'm kind of hoping that they are because I've got a lot of Antonio Gibson. I haven't really moved him in my rankings because the ceiling is just amazing. But with someone like Najee Harris looking safer and safer, I can absolutely understand going that direction than going with Antonio Gibson in round 2. Because I do think Harris's receiving projection is safer. Gibson has the upside, don't get me wrong. But if you're someone who'd rather strive for safety, Harris is a safer bet for that work at this point. It feels like I have to talk about Ja'Marr Chase, doesn't it? Chase has struggled so far. Not just by what we're hearing out of Bengals camp, but we've seen him in the preseason and he's had issues with drops. He just kind of seems unsure of himself. I think this is only natural when you take a year off from playing football. I'm not concerned about Chase long term. In redraft though, I don't think it's necessary to spend on Chase at cost. He's being drafted as a low-end wide receiver too. Now, Chase was a 99th percentile wide receiver in my model. He was a very, 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 very good prospect. An elite prospect. That doesn't mean he has to be incredibly fantasy relevant in year 1. T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd are there. And while Cincinnati's going to likely be pass heavy as they've been under Zach Taylor, Chase isn't a lock to see a 20% target share. But even if he does get to 20%, he's not a lock to finish as a low-end wide receiver too. My projections have him at a 20% share, and he's the wide receiver 31 in my projections. I probably should have called him out as a player to avoid last week, or generally avoid. This really isn't an overreaction to his drops either. Like I said, I think it's natural for him to be a little bit rusty after not playing for so long. But I don't think we should be making too many strong assumptions given there are alternatives in that offense. And where Ja'Marr Chase is being drafted, there are alternatives in your fantasy draft. I don't know how we can confidently be drafting Kenny Golladay right now. I didn't mind the landing spot in New York when he first signed there because there were definitely worse spots for Kenny Golladay to go. But he hasn't practiced in over 2 weeks. He's playing on a team with one of the least desirable offensive coordinators in the league to go along with a projected poor offensive line and a quarterback who's been below average in quarterback rating under pressure over the last 2 years. His being absent from practice isn't allowing him to get those reps in with Daniel Jones. It was hard to be overly bullish on Babytron entering the year. He fits some things that I look for structurally, like him being the first pass catcher being drafted from his team. But there are a lot of things pointing to this being an uphill battle for Kenny Golladay in year one with the Giants. I hope I'm wrong, but he's someone who's fallen in my rankings since that injury in early August. The last player I want to talk about today is another wide receiver who's been missing time this offseason, and that's Curtis Samuel. He had a groin injury at first, then he was put on the COVID-19 list, so he hasn't gotten many reps. Ron Rivera doesn't seem that concerned. He said, according to Adam Schefter, quote, "There's no timetable for Curtis. He's been in the system, he knows it. Yeah, you'd love for him to catch a few reps maybe in the last preseason game, but we're not going to rush him out there." Here's the thing. I think Dyami Brown is a very good wide receiver. He checked a lot of boxes in my prospect model, and he's had a good preseason. I'm curious as to what Rivera is speaking to when he says that Samuel's been in the system and he knows it. Like, I know he's referring to his time with Samuel in the past, and with Scott Turner influencing the offense. Turner's now the offensive coordinator in Washington with Rivera, and he was the quarterbacks coach in Carolina with Curtis Samuel and Ron Rivera. The gang's back together. This is the thing. When Samuel played for Rivera and he had Turner with him, his average depth of target was significantly higher than what it was last year without Rivera. We all thought Samuel would be this like Swiss Army knife type of player at the NFL level. And he was used that way more in the slot last year with Matt Rule in Carolina. But with Rivera, he was the opposite. His average depth of target actually got cut in half from 2019 to 2020. And during that time, during that transition, we saw his slot snap rate go from 29% with Ron Rivera to 71% last year. That's according to Pro Football Focus. Washington has a slot receiver in Adam Humphries, and Dyami Brown is a perimeter receiver. So given Rivera's statement and just how they utilized Curtis Samuel before, I would expect Curtis Samuel to be a perimeter receiver for Washington. That means Dyami Brown wouldn't get that much playing time to start the season. And I think the most likely outcome here is that Dyami ends up not having this massive rookie year production-wise. But considering Samuel hasn't been getting reps, considering I'm a believer in Dyami Brown, it's not hard to envision a scenario where Samuel's workload isn't as big as we might have thought a month or two ago. I mean, look, you don't really have to hardcore fade Curtis Samuel. It doesn't really matter at his cost. That's not the point to this. I'm bringing him up because some of the things have worked against him over the last month. A lot of things have. And that's what today's show is really all about. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Before I let you guys go, a lot of you may already be aware, but well-known fantasy analyst Mike Tagliere of Fantasy Pros has been in the hospital over the last couple of weeks fighting COVID-19. Mike's a great human being. He's always bringing positivity to the shows that he's on. He's got a lot of football knowledge that he drops, and he's always been there for me personally. So I wanted to get everyone listening to this show to send prayers, positive vibes, positive thoughts, whatever works best for you, to send that to Mike, his wife Tabby, and the rest of his family. We all can't wait to get you back on Twitter and back on your podcast talking football tags. Keep fighting. Thanks, everyone.